So this is the part two video. Previously, we just talked about interpersonal in groups and out groups, and now we want to spend a little bit of time talking about systemic in groups and out groups. And so, can you have racism without racists? And so, one of the questions that I'd like to have you ponder or think about is this picture of these nuts. And so, I have grown up referring to them as Brazil nuts, but they also have another name that, particularly in the 50s and 60s, were used to identify these nuts. And so when you think about these particular nuts, and some of you may know exactly what I'm talking about, and others of you uh, may not know, but I want you to look up the slang term if you don't know what I'm referring to, or feel free to ask a friend. Right. And so, was the common term for these nuts in the 1950s, was that a racist term or not? So that's something to think about, and why or why not. So if you said yes, why'd you say yes? If no, why did you say no? So think about your thinking. Um, and were the people who used the derogatory term for these particular nuts, were they racist? And why or why not? Right. And then lastly, uh, what do you think is the at the root of this particular the naming of these nuts? Was it to um, be inclusive, or was it to be exclusive? Was it to bring people into a larger system, or to accentuate the differences between people? And so, could the naming of those nuts drive racism? Could that be a tool that's used to divide people as opposed to unite them? And so the next set of questions really comes down to, can you have racism without racist? And so sometimes when we talk about race or racism, and racist, we talk about some of those personal things, right? So the individual things that people do, the ways in which people are bigoted or even prejudice on an individual level. And so I don't know for you, there was a mantra that I've, as an adult, have found not to be true, that sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. When in fact, I have found particularly individual racism, racist words towards me really did have a negative impact on me. And so, what are some of those forms of personal racism or personal barriers between people around this idea of race? And then the second thing I want you to think about is, are there systems that either use those personal um, aspects of looking at race and racism to fuel their policies and their procedures, right? So what are some of systemic forms of racism? And you can use either historic things like redlining, or the black codes, or mass incarceration, or you can think about current things that are happening, right? For example, the student who could not walk on his graduation because he had dreaded hair, right? The student in Houston, or maybe there's some workplace policies that we have that continue these personal aspects of racism within a system. And secondly, another way to think about that is to also think about sexism, right? So, can you have sexism without sexist? And so, what are those personal forms of sexism? And then, what are some of the systemic forms of sexism? So, possibly not having lactation rooms, right? Or accommodations for women that are helpful, or having um, lane changes for women delayed because of the possibility that they may be in their quote unquote childbearing years, right? So, what systemic things may be in place that are sexist? And so, at the bottom is just something I want you to reflect upon. It's clear that one does not have to be racist to operate within a system of racism. It is also clear that that can be said for all forms of oppression, right? So if you are a part a system that is oppressive, you don't necessarily have to be the oppressor to be a part of that network of individuals. And um, and one might say that acting against racism means that you are anti-racist. And so if you're acting against racism, you are anti-racism, racist, which the counter would mean that if you are not acting against racism, what might that mean? Right. So if you're not acting against racism, or if you're not acting against sexism, or homophobia or xenophobia, what does that say? Right. So your actions speak louder than your words. Um, so there is that. And then lastly, there's the systemic in and out groups. And so, following the procedure that we've used before, what I'd like for you to do is just think about um, group and out group status on a systemic level. So, what are systemic in groups? And these are groups that have easy access to goods, jobs, services, and money. And what are groups that have limited access to goods, jobs, services, and money? And what might be their thoughts? What might be their behaviors associated with being in the in group or the out group? And so, with that, we'll end this video. Hopefully, you'll find, and we'd encourage you to do this in small groups, have conversations, and engage with your elbow partners or table mates, or in smaller groups, to really go through these questions and talk about the in group and out group status.